Hi Mark, my name is Bella. My student number is S0441017. Tony Mack, the laws that sex workers really want. I'm a freshman at NCUE. I want to talk about sex for money. I'm not like most of people you have heard speaking about prostitution before. I'm not a police officer or a social worker. I'm not academic, a journalist, or a politician. And as you probably have picked out from Miriam's blog, I'm not a nun either. Laughter. Most of those people would tell you that selling sex is degrading, and that no one would ever choose to do it. That's dangerous. Women get abused and killed. In fact, most of those people would say, there should be a law against it. Maybe that sounds reasonable to you. It sounds reasonable to me until the closing month of 2009. When I was working to dead-end minimum wage jobs. Every month my wage would just replenish my overdraft. I was exhausted and my life was going nowhere. Like many others before me, I decided sex for money was a better option. Now, don't get me wrong, I would have loved to have won the lottery instead. But it wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and my rent needed paying. So I signed up for my first shift in a brothel. In the years that have passed, I have had a lot of time to think. I've reconsidered the ideas I once had about prostitution. I've given a lot of thought to consent and the nature of work under capitalizations. I have thought about gender inequality and the sex and reproductive labor of women. I've experienced exploitation and violence at work. I've thought about what's needed to protect other sex workers from those things. Maybe you have thought about them too. In this talk, I will take you through the four-main legal approach applied to sex work throughout the world, and explain why they don't work. Why prohibiting the sex industry actually exacerbates every harm that sex workers have vulnerable to. Then I'm going to tell you about what we as sex workers actually want. The first approach is full criminalization. Half the world, including Russia, South Africa, and most of the US, regulates sex work by criminalizing everyone involved, so that's seller, buyers, and third parties. Lawmakers in these countries apparently hope that the fear of getting arrested would deter people from selling sex. But if you're forced to choose between obeying the laws and failing yourself or your family, or feeding yourself or your family, you're going to do the work anyway and take the risk. Criminalization is a trap. It's hard to get a conventional job when you have a criminal record. Potential employers wouldn't hire you, assuming you still need money. You'll stay in the more flexible, informal economy. The laws force you to keep selling sex, which is the exact opposite of its intended effect. Being criminalized leaves you exposed to mistreatment by the state itself. In many places, you may be coerced into playing a bribe or even into having sex with police officers to avoid arrest. Police and prison guards in Cambodia, for example, have been documented subjecting sex workers to what can only be described as torture, threats at gunpoint, beatings, electric shocks, rape, and denial of food. Another worrying thing, if you are selling sex in places like Kenya, South America, or New York, a police officer can arrest you if you are caught carrying condoms because condoms can legally be used as evidence that you are selling sex. Obviously, this increases HIV risks. Imagine knowing if you are busted carrying condoms, it will be used against you. It is a pretty strong incentive to leave them at home, right? Sex workers working in this place are forced to make a tough choice between risking arrest or having risky sex. What will you choose? Will you pack condoms to go to work? How about if you worry the police officer will rape you when he got you in the van? Second approach to regulating sex work seen in these countries is partial criminalization, where the buying and selling of sex are legal, but surrounding activities like brothel keeping or slushing on the street and banned. Laws like this, we have them in the UK and in France, essentially saying to use sex workers, hey, we don't mind you selling sex, just make sure it's done behind closed doors and all alone. And brothel keeping, by the way, is defined as just two or more sex workers working together. Making that illegal means that many of us work alone, which obviously makes us vulnerable to violent offenders. But we are also vulnerable if we choose to break the laws by working together. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine was nervous after she was attacked and worked, so I said that she could see her clients from my place for a while. During the times, we had another guy turn nasty. I told the guy to leave or I will call the police. And he looked at the two of us and said, "You girls can't call the cops. You are working together. This place is illegal." He was right. He eventually left without getting physical violence, but the knowledge that we were breaking the laws empowered that man to threaten us. He left confident he had got away with it. The prohibition of street prostitution also causes more harm than it prevents. Firstly, to avoid getting arrested, street workers take risks to avoid detection, and that means working alone or in isolated locations like dark forests where they are vulnerable to attack. If you caught selling sex outdoors, you pay a fine. How do you pay a fine without getting back to the streets? It was a need for money that saw you in the street in the first place, and so the fine stack up, and you are caught in a vicious cycle of selling sex to pay the fine you get for selling sex. Let me tell you about Maria named Papa who works in Redbridge, East London. The street workers on her path would normally wait for clips in girls for safety in numbers and to warn each other about how to avoid dangerous guys. But during a police crackdown on sex workers and their clients, she was forced to work alone to avoid being arrested. She was stabbed to death in the early hours of October 29, 2013. She had been working later than usual to try to pay off a fine she had received for socializing. So if criminalizing sex workers hurts them, why not just criminalize the people who buy sex? It's the aim of the third approach I want to talk about, the Swedish or Nordic model of sex workers law. The idea behind this law is that selling sex is intrinsically harmful, and so if you are in fact helping sex workers by removing the option, despite growing support for what's often described as an demand approach, there's no evidence that it works. There's just as much prostitution in Sweden as there was before. Why might that be? It's because people selling sex often don't have other options for income. If you need that money, the only effect that a drop in business is going to have is to force you to lower your price or offer more risky sexual service. If you need to find more clients, you might seek the help of a manager. So you see, Rather than putting a stop to what's often described as pimping, a law like this actually gives oxygen to potentially abusive third parties. To take steps in my work, I try not to take bookings from someone who calls me from a withheld number. If it's a home or hotel visit, I'll try to get a full name and details. I'll work under the Swedish model. A client would be too scared to give me that information. I may have no other choice but to accept a booking from a man who is untraceable if he later turns out to be violent. If you need their money, you need to protect your clients from the police. If you work outdoors, that means working alone or in isolated location, just as if you are criminalized yourself. It might mean getting into cars quicker, less negotiating times means snap decision. Is this guy dangerous or just nervous? Can you afford to take a risk? Can you afford not to? Something I've often hearing is, prostitution will be fine if we made it legal or regulate it. We call that approach legalization. It's used by countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and Nevada in the U.S., but it's not a great model for human rights, and if they control prostitution, commercial sex can only happen in certain illegal designed areas for venues, and sex workers are made to comply with special restrictions like restriction and forced health checks. Regulation sounds great on paper, but politicians deliberate make regulation around the sex industry expensive and difficult to comply with. It creates two-tier system, legal and illegal work. We sometimes call it backdoor criminalization, which will connect brutal owners can comply with the regulation, but more marginalized people find those hopes impossible to jump through, and even if it is possible in principle. Getting a license or proper venues takes time and costs money. It's not going to be an option for someone who's desperate and need money tonight. They might be a refugee or flipping demonstratic abuse. In this two-tiered system, the most vulnerable people are forced to work illegally, so they still exposed to all the dangers of criminalization I mentioned earlier. So, it's looking like all attempts to control or prevent sex work from happening makes things more dangerous for people selling sex. Fear of laws enforcement make them work alone in isolated locations and allows clients and even crops to get abusive in the acknowledged they will get away with it. Fines and criminal records force people to keep selling sex, rather than enable them to stop. Crackdowns on buyers drive sellers to take dangerous risks and into the arms of potentially abusive managers. Those laws also reinforce stigma and hatred against sex workers. When France temporarily brought in a Swedish model 2 years ago, ordinary citizens took it as a clue to start carrying out vigilante attacks against people working on the street. In Sweden, optional surveys show that significantly more people want sex workers to be arrested now than before the law was brought in. If prohibition is less harmful, you might ask, why it is so popular? Firstly, sex work is and always have been a survival strategy for all kinds of unpopular minority groups, people of color, migrants, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, particularly trans women. Those are the groups most heavily profiled and punished through prohibitionist law. I don't think that it is an accident. These laws have political support precisely because they target people that voters don't want to see or know about. Why else might people support prohibition? Well, lots of people have understandable fears about trafficking. Folks think that foreign women kidnapped and sold into sex slavery can be saved by shutting a whole industry down. So let's talk about trafficking. Forced labor does occur in many industries, especially those where the workers are immigrants or otherwise vulnerable and enlisted to be addressed. But it's best addressed with legislation targeting those specific abuse, not an entire industry. When 23 undocumented Chinese migrants drowned while picking crocus in Morecambe Bay in 2004, there were no calls to outlaw the entire seafood industry to save trafficking victims. The solution is clearly to give workers more legal protection, allowing them to resist abuse and report it to authorities without fear of arrest. The way the term trafficking is thrown around implies that all undocumented migration into prostitution is forced. In fact, many migrants have made a decision out of economic need to place themselves into the hands of people smugglers. Many do this with full acknowledge that they will be selling sex when they reach their destination, and yes, it can often be the case that these people smugglers demand prohibitive fees. It coerces migrants into works that they don't want to do and abuse them when they are vulnerable. The truth of prostitution, but it is also a truth of agricultural work, hospitality work, and domestic work. Ultimately, nobody wants to be forced to do any kind of work, but it's like a risk many migrants are willing to take because of what they are leaving behind. If people were allowed to migrate illegal, they wouldn't have to place their lives into the hands of people smugglers. The problems arise from the criminalization of migration just as they do from the criminalization of sex work itself. It's a lesson of history. If you try to prohibit something that people want or need to do, whether it's drinking alcohol or crossing borders or getting an abortion or selling sex, you create more problems than you solve. Prohibition barely makes a difference to the amount of people actually doing those things, but it makes a huge difference as to whether or not they are safe when they do them. Why else might people support prohibition? As a feminist, I know that the sex industry is a site of deeply entrenched social inequality. It's a fact that most buyers of sex are men with money, and most sellers are women without. You can agree with all that, I do, and still think prohibition is a terrible policies. In a better, more equal world, maybe there would be far further people selling sex to survive. But if you can simply legislate a better world into existence, if someone needs to sell sex because they are poor, or because they are homeless, or because they are undocumented and they can't find legal work, taking away that option doesn't make them any less poor or harm them or change their immigration status. People worry that selling sex is degrading. Ask yourself, is it more degrading than going hungry or seeing your children go hungry? There's no call to ban rich people from hiring nannies or getting men's clothes, even for most of the people doing that labor are poor. Migrant women. It's a fact of poor migrant women selling sex specifically that has some feminine uncomfortable. And I can understand why the sex industry provokes strong feelings. People have all kinds of complicated feelings when it comes to sex, and we can make policies on the basis of mere feelings, especially not over the head of the people actually affected by those policies. If we get fixated on the abolition of sex work, we end up worrying more about a particular manifestation of gender inequality rather than about the underlying causes. People get really hung up on the question, well, you want your daughter doing it? Let's wrong question instead. Imagine she's doing it. How safe is she at work tonight? Why isn't she safer? So you have looked at for criminalization, partial criminalization, the Swedish or Nordic model and legislation, and how they all cast home. Something I never heard asked is, what do sex workers want? After all, we are the ones most affected by these laws. Now, New Zealand criminalized sex work in 2003. It's crucial to remember that discrimination and legalization are not the same thing. Discrimination means the removal of laws that punitively target the sex industry, instead treating sex work much like any other kind of work. In New Zealand, people can work together for safety, and employers of sex workers are accountable to the state. A sex worker can refuse to seek a client at any time for any reason, and 96% of street workers report that they feel the laws protect their rights. Now, New Zealand hasn't actually seen an increase in an amount of people doing sex work, but discriminating it has made it a lot safer. But the lesson from New Zealand isn't just that it is particular legislation is good, but it's crucially, it was written in a collaboration with sex workers, namely the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. When it comes to making sex work safer, they are ready to hear it straight from sex workers themselves. Here in the UK, I'm part of sex worker-led groups like the Sex Worker Open Universe and the English Collective or Prostitute, and we form part of a global movement demanding discrimination and self-determination. The universal symbol of our movement is the red umbrella. We are supporting our demands by global bodies like UNAIDS, the World Health Organization, and Amnesty International. But we need more allies. If you are care about gender equality or poverty or migration or public health, then sex workers' rights matter to you. Make space for us in your movement. That means not only listening to sex workers when we speak about, but amplifying our voice, resisting those who silence us, those who say that a prostitute is either to victims, to damage, to know what's best for herself, or else to privilege and to remove from real hardship, not representative of the billions of voiceless victims. This distinction between victim and empowered is imaginary. It is easy purely to discredit sex workers and make it easy to ignore us. No doubt many of you work for a living. Well, sex work is work too, just like you. Some of us like our jobs, some of us hate them. Ultimately, most of us has mixed feelings, but how we feel about our works isn't the point, and how others feel about our works certainly isn't. What's important is that we have the right to work safely and on our own terms. Sex workers are are real people who have had complicated experience and complicated response to those experience. But our demands are not complicated. You can ask expensive escort in New York City, brutal workers in Cambodia, strict workers in South Africa, and even every girl on the roster at my old job in Soho. And they will all tell you the same thing. You can speak to millions of sex workers and countless sex work-related organizations. We want full discrimination and labor rights as workers. I'm just one sex worker on the stage today, but I'm bringing a message from all over the world. Thank you. Applause. It's all about my recording. Thank you.